It was past midnight, the house silent in that fragile way it only becomes when everyone else is certain the world is exactly as it should be. I stood in front of my bedroom mirror, hands trembling, breath shallow, as if I were about to confess a crime instead of a truth. The glass reflected a version of me I had rehearsed for years, broad shoulders tucked inward, jaw clenched in practiced restraint, eyes trained to look steady even when they weren't. But that night, the reflection felt less like an ally and more like an accusation. I had hidden this side of me for so long that it had started to feel like a ghost living in my ribs. As a child, I didn't have words for it. I only knew that when my cousin left her scarf draped over a chair, I felt drawn to its softness like it held a secret meant for me. I only knew that when I watched the women in my family get ready for weddings, adjusting earrings, smoothing fabric, laughing at their own reflections, something inside me stirred with longing so intense it almost hurt. It wasn't about imitation. It wasn't a costume. It was recognition. But recognition can be terrifying when it doesn't match the script handed to you. Growing up in a place where expectations are ironclad and identities are inherited like family heirlooms, I learned early how to perform. I deepened my voice. I monitored the sway of my walk. I laughed at jokes that made something in me shrink. Every day felt like stepping into armor that didn't quite fit, but was praised by everyone around me. Strong. Handsome. You'll make us proud. Each compliment felt like a brick sealing off a doorway I didn't know how to open. The mirror became my quiet witness. At 13, I started lingering in front of it when no one was home. I would tilt my head slightly, soften my expression, imagine my features rearranged into something gentler. Sometimes I'd hold a towel over my head like long hair and watch how it changed the story my face told. I would whisper names under my breath, not because I wanted to erase myself, but because I was searching for the version of me that felt like truth instead of performance. Then I would drop the towel, square my shoulders, and practice being who everyone thought I was. The first time I tried on actual clothes, a simple cardigan and a skirt I had secretly ordered online, my heart pounded so loudly I was sure the neighbors could hear it through the walls. I had waited until everyone was asleep. My room door was locked. The curtains were drawn. I moved carefully, reverently, as if handling something sacred. When the fabric settled against my skin, I felt something shift. It wasn't dramatic. There was no cinematic swell of music, just a quiet exhale that seemed to come from the deepest part of me. My shoulders relaxed. My jaw unclenched. I stood straighter, not in the rigid way I had practiced for years, but in a way that felt natural, balanced. When I turned toward the mirror, I expected shame to rush in. Instead, I saw peace. Not perfection. Not instant transformation. But alignment. And that terrified me. Because if this felt right, what did that say about everything else? I remember staring at my reflection, fingers brushing the hem of the skirt, tears gathering without permission. I wasn't crying because I felt ridiculous. I was crying because I felt seen by myself. The mirror didn't mock me. It didn't argue. It simply reflected back a version of me that looked honest. But honesty has consequences. The morning, I folded the clothes carefully and hid them in a box beneath my bed. As I slid it into the shadows, it felt like I was burying a heartbeat. All day, I moved through the world as usual, answering questions, nodding at expectations, laughing on cue. But everything felt slightly off, like I was living half a second out of sync with myself. That night, I dreamed of mirrors. Endless corridors lined with them, each reflecting a different version of me. Some looked afraid. Some looked angry. One, just one, smiled softly, as if waiting for me to catch up. I woke up with a decision forming, fragile but persistent. This wasn't going away. For years, I had told myself it was a phase, a curiosity, a private eccentricity I could manage quietly. But the feeling wasn't fading. It was growing roots. It showed up in the way I lingered over certain songs, in the way I envied the effortless grace of women walking confidently down the street, in the way my chest tightened whenever someone made a casual joke about real men. Every joke felt like a reminder that I was standing on a fault line. I started keeping a journal, writing in it late at night when the world felt softer. I wrote about the mirror, about the cardigan, about the strange, electric calm I felt when I allowed myself to exist without performance. The words spilled out faster than I could control them. I wasn't just describing clothes, I was describing a hunger to live without constant correction. But the fear was just as loud. What would my family say? My friends? Would they see betrayal?
Confusion?
Would they laugh? Would they turn away? The thought of losing everything I had built, even if it was built on a version of me that felt incomplete, was paralyzing. So I compromised with myself. I would keep this side hidden. I would visit her, the version of me in the mirror, only at night. It would be our secret, a quiet rebellion against a world that felt too rigid. And for a while, that seemed enough. Until the night the mirror didn't just reflect me, it challenged me. I was standing there again, cardigan wrapped around my shoulders, hair carefully styled to frame my face. I had practiced subtle makeup techniques from countless online tutorials, learning how light and shadow could soften angles I had spent years trying to harden. I looked into my own eyes and felt something new, not just peace.
Pride.
And that scared me more than anything, because pride meant I didn't want to hide anymore. I leaned closer to the mirror, fingertips resting against the cool glass, and whispered, "How much longer?" The reflection didn't answer, but the silence felt like a countdown. "Would you like to continue to the next part?" Next. The countdown began quietly, almost politely, as if my own reflection didn't want to startle me. In the days that followed, I felt a shift I couldn't reverse. The box under my bed no longer felt like a hiding place. It felt like a promise waiting to be kept. I would sit through conversations at work, nodding at spreadsheets and deadlines, but my mind drifted back to that soft cardigan folded with care. I found myself studying the way women around me carried themselves, not with envy anymore, but with a kind of focused curiosity. How they tucked loose strands of hair behind their ears. How they paused before speaking, not to shrink, but to choose their words with intention. I wasn't trying to copy anyone. I was trying to decode myself. The mirror became less of a secret and more of a rehearsal space. Each night, I allowed myself a little more honesty. I practiced walking across my room in heels I'd ordered after weeks of hesitation. At first, I wobbled, gripping the wall for balance, laughing nervously at my own awkwardness. But gradually, the steps smoothed out. My spine aligned differently. My chin lifted. I realized how much of posture is emotional, how confidence isn't just a mindset, it's geometry. And yet, every step forward in private felt like a step closer to collision in public. The first crack in my carefully built wall came from something small. A friend invited me to a small gathering, nothing extravagant, just a few people, soft music, warm lights. Normally, I would have reached automatically for the safe uniform of my life. Jeans, neutral shirt, shoulders squared. But that night, I stood in front of my closet for a long time. The mirror watched. My heart pounded as I held two outfits side by side. One predictable, one daring. The daring one wasn't dramatic. It was subtle. Slim black trousers, a slightly oversized sweater with a softer cut, a delicate necklace barely visible unless someone looked closely. It wasn't a costume. It was a whisper. I wore the whisper. The entire walk to the gathering felt like crossing a thin sheet of ice. I was hyper-aware of everything. The way the fabric moved when I walked, the way my hands gestured when I spoke. I kept expecting someone to stop mid-sentence, point, and say, "What are you doing?" No one did, but I felt the difference. I wasn't performing masculinity as forcefully. I allowed my voice to settle into a natural cadence instead of artificially lowering it. I let my expression soften. And something unexpected happened. I felt lighter. At one point, while laughing at a story, I caught my reflection in a darkened window. For a split second, I didn't see conflict. I saw integration, a blending of who I had been and who I was becoming. It wasn't dramatic enough for anyone else to notice. But to me, it felt monumental. Then came the first comment. "You seem different lately," my friend said casually, tilting their head. Not accusing. Just curious. Different. The word echoed in my chest. My immediate instinct was to retreat, to correct course, to armor up. But instead, I smiled gently and asked, "Different how?" They shrugged. "I don't know. More comfortable, maybe?" Comfortable. It was such a simple observation, but it nearly unraveled me. I excused myself to the bathroom a few minutes later, locked the door, and stood in front of the mirror there. The fluorescent light was unforgiving, clinical. But even under that glare, I saw it. The ease around my eyes, the absence of strain around my mouth. For years, I had been praised for strength. But this was the first time someone had noticed softness and framed it as something positive. I pressed my palm against the mirror and felt tears threaten to rise again. Not from shame this time, but from relief. Still, relief is fragile. The week, I pushed a little further. I painted my nails with a clear gloss, subtle enough to pass unnoticed, noticeable enough that I could see the shine when light hit my hands. It felt like carrying a secret spark everywhere I went. Every time I reached for something, every time I typed, the faint gleam reminded me, "You're still here." But not everyone responds to subtlety with kindness. A coworker noticed. "Did you start using some kind of polish?" he asked, half laughing, half skeptical. The room seemed to tilt. I could have denied it, could have shrugged it off. Instead, I said calmly, "Yeah, I like how it looks." There was a pause, not long, but long enough to feel like standing on the edge of a cliff. He blinked, clearly unsure how to categorize my answer. Then he shrugged.
Huh.
Okay. And just like that, the world didn't end. But my heart didn't stop racing for a solid hour. That night, in front of my mirror, I replayed the moment over and over. The fear, the decision, the simple honesty. I realized something crucial. The dread I had carried for years was often louder than reality. Not always. I wasn't naive enough to think rejection wasn't possible, but often. The mirror no longer felt like a silent witness. It felt like a collaborator. I started experimenting more boldly at home. Longer wigs, subtle contouring, different silhouettes of clothing. Each adjustment wasn't about escaping my old self. It was about discovering the spectrum I had denied. I would sit on my bed afterward, breathing deeply, letting the emotions crest and settle. Sometimes I felt exhilarated. Sometimes grief washed over me. Grief for the years spent shrinking, correcting, suppressing. One evening, after removing my makeup, I stared at my bare face for a long time. No cardigan, no polish, no wig.
Just me.
And I realized something that startled me. The femininity I was uncovering wasn't separate from me. It had always been there, woven into my expressions, my gestures, my sensitivity. I hadn't created something new. I had uncovered something buried. But uncovering is not the same as revealing. The tension between private truth and public life began to tighten. I found myself hesitating before family gatherings, wondering how much longer I could maintain the divide. The box under my bed felt heavier each time I slid it out. It no longer symbolized safety. It symbolized delay. One night, I stood in front of the mirror again, fully dressed, hair falling gently over my shoulders, a soft dress replacing the cardigan for the first time. My reflection looked steady. Not defiant, not pleading, just steady. And for the first time, I asked a different question. What if hiding is the only thing that's hurting you? The silence that followed was louder than any argument I'd ever had with myself. Would you like to continue to the next part? Next. The question lingered in the air for days, following me like a shadow I could no longer outrun. What if hiding is the only thing that's hurting you? I tried to dismiss it as dramatic, as something born from too many late nights and too much introspection. But the more I moved through my daily life, the more I felt the weight of the split I had been maintaining. It wasn't just about clothes anymore. It was about breath, how shallow it felt when I monitored every gesture, every tone, every reaction. I began noticing how exhausted I was at the end of each day. Not physically, emotionally, as if I had been holding up a wall with my bare hands for years and my arms were finally shaking. The mirror, once a secret accomplice, had become a threshold. One Sunday afternoon, my family gathered at my parents' house. The usual sounds filled the space: clinking dishes, overlapping conversations, familiar laughter. I stood in the hallway before entering the living room, adjusting my shirt cuffs, feeling the familiar armor settle onto my shoulders. It fit perfectly. It always had. That was the problem. I caught my reflection in the hallway mirror, a narrow, slightly warped piece of glass that had hung there since I was a child. I stared at it longer than usual. The version of me looking back seemed tired. Not weak. Not broken. Just tired. During dinner, someone made a passing comment about how men these days are getting softer. It was meant as a joke, light-hearted. But the table erupted into knowing laughter, nods of agreement. I forced a smile, but inside, something tightened.
Softer.
They said it like it was a flaw, like softness was erosion. I excused myself to the bathroom, locking the door behind me. The mirror above the sink was small, framed in old wood. I leaned forward, bracing my hands against the counter. Why does this feel like a battle? I whispered to my reflection. The face staring back at me looked composed, but my eyes betrayed the storm underneath.
I wasn't angry at them.
I wasn't even angry at the comment. I was exhausted from translating myself into something more acceptable. I splashed water on my face and watched droplets slide down my cheeks. For a brief, irrational second, I wished I could wash away expectation the same way. When I returned to the table, I listened differently. I noticed how often people police themselves too, how often they laughed a little too hard, agreed a little too quickly. Maybe I wasn't the only one performing. Maybe we all were, in different ways. That thought gave me an unexpected sliver of courage. The next week, I did something that terrified me. I stepped outside as her. Not dramatically. Not during rush hour. Just a quiet evening walk in a part of town where the streets were calm and the sky was streaked with fading gold. I wore a simple dress, nothing flashy, and a light jacket. My hair framed my face gently. My makeup was subtle, practiced. When I closed my front door behind me, my heart felt like it was trying to break free from my chest. Every sound was amplified. The click of my shoes on the pavement, the rustle of fabric, the distant hum of traffic. I was hyper-aware of my body in space, of how I occupied it. For the first few steps, I felt like everyone was staring, even though the street was nearly empty. Then something shifted. With each step, my breathing steadied. My posture softened into something natural. The evening air felt different against my skin, not because it had changed, but because I had. A couple walked past me. They glanced briefly, then continued their conversation. No double takes. No whispers. The world kept spinning. Halfway down the street, I passed a shop window and caught my reflection in the glass. The city lights shimmered behind me, turning the image into something almost cinematic. I stopped walking. There I was. Not perfect. Not unafraid. But real. A laugh escaped me. Soft, incredulous. It wasn't joy in the explosive sense. It was relief. The kind that seeps into your bones slowly. But relief can be interrupted. As I turned the corner to head back home, a group of teenagers approached from the opposite direction.
Loud.
Restless. My pulse spiked instantly. I felt the old instinct surge, shrink, disappear, minimize. They walked past me. One of them glanced at me, held my gaze for a split second longer than comfortable. I braced for something, a comment, a smirk, a word thrown like a stone. Nothing came. They kept walking. I stood there for a moment, stunned by the anticlimax. It struck me how much of my fear had been built on imagined outcomes. That didn't mean danger didn't exist. It did. But I had been living as if every step outside would guarantee disaster. That night, back in my room, I stood before the mirror again, still dressed, cheeks flushed from adrenaline. "You did it," I whispered. The reflection smiled. But the emotional high was followed by something heavier.
Grief.
I sat on the edge of my bed and let it wash over me. Grief for the years I had denied myself this simple act of walking down a street as I felt inside. Grief for the version of me who believed survival required invisibility. The mirror across the room seemed different now. Less intimidating. Less like a judge. More like a doorway I had finally stepped through. And yet, stepping through once is not the same as living there. The next morning, I returned to my usual presentation for work. The contrast felt sharper than ever. It wasn't that I hated the way I looked. It was that I felt like I was editing myself again, trimming softness, sharpening edges. Midday, I caught my reflection in the dark screen of my computer during a pause. For a fleeting second, I imagined what it would look like if I stopped editing. The thought sent a thrill through me, followed immediately by fear. Because walking down a quiet street is one thing. Letting the people who have known you your entire life see you differently, that's another. And deep down, I knew the next step wasn't about strangers. It was about honesty. Would you like to continue to the next part?
Next.
Honesty arrived quietly, not as a dramatic announcement, but as a moment I could no longer postpone. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday evening. I was sitting at my desk, the glow of my laptop reflecting faintly in the darkened window. My journal lay open beside me, pages filled with late-night confessions written in hurried ink. I had spent years telling the mirror the truth. I had told paper the truth. But I had never told another person. The thought felt like standing at the edge of a cliff again, except this time, I couldn't see the bottom. I picked up my phone and scrolled through my contacts, my thumb hovering over one name.
Sam.
We had been friends for years. The kind of friend who had seen me at my worst during exam stress, who had listened to my doubts about career choices, who once told me, half-jokingly, that I think too much for my own good. If anyone might listen without turning it into spectacle, it would be Sam. Still, my hand shook as I typed. Can we talk? Like really talk? The 3 dots appeared almost immediately. Of course. Everything okay? My chest tightened. I stared at the blinking cursor before typing back. I don't know. I just need to say something out loud. We agreed to meet the next evening at a quiet cafe we both liked, a place with warm lighting and soft music that felt forgiving. The entire day leading up to it felt like waiting for a verdict. At work, I moved through tasks mechanically. Every time I caught my reflection in a window, in a spoon, in the glossy surface of a table, I imagined what it would be like after the words were spoken. Would the reflection look freer? Or fractured? When the evening finally came, I stood in front of my mirror, heart racing. The mirror again. It had witnessed every rehearsal, every tear, every whispered question. Tonight, it would witness something different, not a transformation of appearance, but of courage. I chose an outfit that felt like a bridge between my worlds. Soft, but not overtly feminine. A sweater that draped a little more gently over my frame. Subtle polish on my nails again. Nothing that screamed, just something that whispered, "This is me," closer to the truth. You don't have to explain everything perfectly, I told my reflection. You just have to be honest. The cafe smelled like coffee and cinnamon when I walked in. Sam was already there, waving casually. That normalcy almost broke me. The way life keeps moving even when your internal world feels seismic. We ordered drinks. Sat down. Small talk flickered between us for a few minutes, awkward and brittle. Finally, Sam leaned forward slightly. So, what's going on? The moment stretched. My throat felt dry. My pulse pounded in my ears. For a second, I considered retreating, laughing it off, saying I'd been stressed about work. It would have been so easy. Instead, I exhaled slowly and said, "There's something about me I've been hiding for a long time." Sam didn't interrupt. Just nodded, eyes steady. I've always felt. I searched for the right word, one that didn't sound dramatic or rehearsed. Different. Not in a vague way. In a specific way. I don't feel comfortable living only as the person everyone assumes I am. The words hung between us. I continued, voice quieter now but steadier. There's a side of me that feels more feminine. And I've been exploring that. Privately. For years. There it was. Not a perfect explanation. Not a thesis. Just truth. Sam blinked once, absorbing it. The silence that followed felt enormous. My mind filled it with worst-case scenarios, confusion, dismissal, subtle distancing. Instead, Sam asked gently, "Is this something that makes you feel more like yourself?" The question disarmed me. "Yes," I said immediately, emotion rising unexpectedly. "It does. It feels aligned. Like I'm not fighting myself all the time." Sam nodded again, slower this time. "Then I'm glad you told me." I stared at them, searching for cracks in their expression. There were none. Just curiosity and something else, care. "You're not weirded out?" I asked, the vulnerability in my voice impossible to hide. Sam gave a small, almost incredulous smile. "You think I'd stop being your friend because you're trying to be honest about who you are?" The tension I'd been holding for years loosened slightly in my chest. "I was scared," I admitted. "I can see that," Sam said softly. "But I'm more interested in who you actually are than who you think you have to pretend to be." That sentence felt like a key turning in a lock I didn't know was there. We talked for over an hour. I explained the mirror, the secret walks, the way softness felt like strength instead of weakness. I expected to feel exposed, but instead I felt grounded, like the words were building something instead of tearing it down. When we finally stood to leave, Sam paused before we stepped outside. "Can I ask something?" they said.
Yeah.
"Do you want me to use a different name for you? Or different pronouns?" The question hit me like a wave. I hadn't let myself go that far yet. Not out loud. "I'm still figuring that out," I admitted. "But maybe someday." Sam smiled. "Okay, whenever you're ready." On the walk home, the air felt different again. Not because of how I was dressed, but because I wasn't alone with my truth anymore. That night, I stood in front of my mirror once more. "You're not a secret," I whispered to my reflection. For the first time, the mirror didn't feel like the only place I existed. But telling one person was not the same as telling the world. And deep down, I knew the next test wouldn't be in a softly lit cafe. It would be closer to home. Would you like to continue to the next part? Closer to home meant closer to the people whose opinions had shaped me before I even understood what shaping was. For days after telling Sam, I carried a quiet glow inside me. It wasn't loud or defiant. It was steady, like a candle protected by cupped hands. I found myself standing a little taller, speaking a little more naturally. Even when I dressed the way everyone expected, I no longer felt entirely erased. Someone else knew. The truth had air now. But home has a way of testing whatever fragile progress you think you've made. It was my mother's birthday when everything tightened again. The house was full, relatives, familiar laughter, the comforting chaos of shared history. I stood in my childhood bedroom before the celebration began, staring at the old mirror mounted on the closet door. It was slightly scratched, the silvering at the edges worn thin. This mirror had watched me grow up. It had watched me practice smiles before school. It had watched me try on confidence that didn't always fit. And it had watched me bury myself. I ran my hand along the frame, remembering the first time I draped a towel over my head as pretend hair. The first time I tilted my chin and softened my expression just to see what might happen. I felt that same ache now, not because I was confused, but because I was clearer than ever. Downstairs, someone called my name. I glanced at my reflection one more time. "Not tonight," I whispered. Not as surrender, just as timing. The evening moved forward in waves of conversation and clinking glasses. At first, I managed to stay present, laughing at old stories, helping carry dishes to the table. But then my aunt, in her usual affectionate but blunt way, nudged my shoulder and said, "You've been awfully quiet lately. Everything okay? You're not changing on us, are you?" The words were playful, but they landed like a stone dropped into still water.
Changing.
I felt the ripple through my chest. For a second, I considered deflecting with humor. I had perfected that move. Instead, I heard my own voice respond, calm but deliberate. "Maybe I am." The table quieted slightly, not dramatically, just enough for me to notice. My aunt laughed, assuming it was a joke. "Well, as long as you're still you. As long as you're still you." The phrase echoed long after the conversation shifted elsewhere. I excused myself again, a familiar retreat, and climbed the stairs back to my room. My pulse was racing, not from confrontation, but from proximity. The truth had brushed against the surface of the room, and everyone had stepped around it without noticing. In my bedroom, I closed the door and leaned against it, breathing deeply. The mirror waited. I stepped in front of it slowly. Am I still me? I asked my reflection. The face staring back at me looked conflicted, not because I doubted who I was, but because I doubted whether others would recognize me if I stopped editing myself for their comfort. I opened my closet and stared at the hidden box beneath the bed. It felt heavier than ever, not because of what was inside, but because of what it represented: delay, fear, preservation. On impulse, before I could talk myself out of it, I pulled it out. The familiar cardigan. The soft dress. The wig carefully stored in its net. I held the fabric in my hands, feeling its texture like a memory. Downstairs, laughter swelled again. My heart pounded so loudly, I thought I might feel it in my throat. I didn't put everything on. Not that night. But I did something small and irreversible. I slipped the delicate necklace, the one barely noticeable unless someone looked closely, around my neck. It rested there, cool against my skin, hidden beneath my shirt but undeniably present. A quiet declaration. When I returned downstairs, no one reacted. No one knew. But I did. And somehow that knowledge changed the way I stood in the room. I wasn't pretending quite as hard. I wasn't shrinking to fit quite as tightly. Later that night, as guests began to leave, my mother hugged me tightly at the door. She pulled back slightly, studying my face in that way only mothers can. "You seem different lately," she said softly. The words froze me in place. "Different how?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She smiled faintly. "More thoughtful. Like you're carrying something important." My breath caught. "I guess I am," I admitted. She brushed her thumb lightly against my shoulder. "Just make sure whatever it is, it doesn't make you feel alone." Alone. That word pierced deeper than she could have known. "I'm trying not to be," I said honestly. When the house finally emptied and the lights dimmed, I stood alone in the living room for a moment. The silence felt heavier than usual. Not oppressive, just full. I walked back upstairs and stood before the mirror again, this time with the necklace glinting faintly at my collarbone. "You're not disappearing," I told my reflection. "You're emerging." But emergence isn't linear. The next morning, doubt crept in like fog. Had I imagined the acceptance with Sam? Was I misreading my mother's tone? Was I building courage on fragile ground? Fear has a way of rewriting progress overnight. I sat on my bed, staring at my hands. The polish had chipped slightly at the edges. Imperfect. Visible.
Real.
For the first time, I considered something I had avoided naming directly. This wasn't just about clothing. It wasn't just about presentation. It was about identity, about allowing myself to exist without constant self-correction. The mirror across the room seemed to pulse with the weight of that realization. If I kept taking small steps, there would come a point where small wouldn't be enough. And the idea of that inevitable moment both thrilled and terrified me. Because the next step wouldn't just be symbolic. It would be visible. Would you like to continue to the next part? Next. Visible. The word followed me for weeks, stretching and reshaping itself in my mind. Visibility wasn't just about clothes or gestures anymore. It was about presence, about whether I allowed myself to take up space as I truly felt, or whether I continued negotiating my existence down to something more digestible. The mirror had stopped being a question mark. It was becoming a compass. One evening, after another long day of measured conversations and controlled body language, I came home feeling hollow. Not defeated, just tired of splitting myself into acceptable portions. I stood in front of the mirror, without turning on the overhead light. The room was dim, lit only by the city glow filtering through the curtains. My reflection looked softer in that half-light, edges blurred. "I can't keep visiting you like this," I whispered. "I want to live here." The honesty startled me. For years, I had framed this side of myself as an indulgence, a private exploration, something adjacent to my real life. But what if this wasn't adjacent? What if this was central? The thought both steadied and shook me. I reached for the box beneath my bed again, not with trembling hands this time, but with intention. I dressed slowly, deliberately, not as someone sneaking, but as someone preparing. The dress settled naturally against my frame. The wig fell into place more easily than it had months ago. My makeup hand was steadier now, the motions familiar. When I finally faced the mirror, I didn't search for flaws. I searched for fear. It was there, yes, in the quick rhythm of my pulse, in the way my breath caught. But beneath it was something stronger, recognition. The kind that doesn't argue. I took out my phone and opened the front-facing camera. For months, I had avoided taking pictures. A photo felt permanent, evidence of something I wasn't ready to defend. But this time, I held the phone up and looked directly into the lens.
Click.
The image captured wasn't glamorous or dramatic. It was quiet, thoughtful,
Real.
I stared at it for a long time, my thumb hovering over the delete button. Then I did something that felt even braver. I sent it to Sam. No caption, just the photo. The 3 dots appeared quickly. Then, you look peaceful. Peaceful. Not different. Not surprising. Not even beautiful. Just peaceful. I exhaled, a tension releasing from somewhere deep in my spine. Is this how you want to be seen? Sam asked next. The question lingered longer than I expected. My instinct was to say, I'm not sure. To leave myself an escape hatch. Instead, I typed, yes. That one word felt seismic. The next step came faster than I anticipated. A few days later, Sam invited me to a small art exhibit downtown, a low-key event, dim lights, creative crowd. Come as you, they added casually. The simplicity of that phrase unraveled me again. Come as you. I stood in front of my mirror that evening with the invitation open on my phone. My heart raced, but not with the same frantic energy as before. This felt less like trespassing and more like crossing a threshold I had already been standing at for months. I chose an outfit that felt true, not exaggerated, not cautious. A soft blouse, tailored trousers, a light touch of makeup that highlighted rather than disguised. I studied myself carefully, not for approval, but for alignment. The mirror reflected someone steady. Okay, I whispered. Let's be visible. The walk to the exhibit felt surreal. Streetlights flickered overhead. Passing cars hummed by. I expected the world to shift dramatically, but it didn't. The city continued as it always had. The only thing that had changed was my willingness to occupy my body fully. When I stepped inside the gallery, warm light washed over me. Paintings lined the walls, bold colors, abstract shapes, stories told without words. Sam spotted me almost immediately and smiled in a way that reached their eyes. No hesitation. No double take. Just recognition. You came, they said softly. As me, I replied. We moved through the exhibit together, pausing in front of different pieces. At one canvas, a swirl of layered colors that seemed chaotic at first glance, but revealed subtle structure the longer you looked. I felt something click. That's how it feels, I murmured. Sam tilted their head. How it feels? Like, I'm not changing into something new. I'm just revealing layers that were always there. They nodded. Most people never get that far. As the evening unfolded, I noticed something unexpected. No one stared. No one pointed. Conversations flowed naturally. When I introduced myself to someone new, my voice didn't waver. I didn't feel like I was pretending or defending. I simply existed. At one point, I caught my reflection in a large framed artwork protected by glass. The gallery lights shimmered behind me, blending my image with the painting itself. For a second, it felt symbolic, like I was finally part of the scene instead of observing it from the outside. And then, just as I began to relax fully, a flicker of doubt surfaced. What happens when this extends beyond safe spaces? Beyond art galleries and supportive friends? What happens at work? At family gatherings? In rooms where the rules are stricter?
The thought tightened my chest.
Because visibility is not selective forever. Later that night, back in my room, I stood before the mirror again. Makeup slightly smudged, hair a little out of place from the evening air. "You can't unknow this now," I said quietly. The reflection looked back at me, unwavering. And for the first time, I realized something profound. The scariest part wasn't that others might reject me. It was that I might shrink myself again to avoid finding out. Would you like to continue to the next part? The word felt heavier than rejection ever had. Because rejection would hurt. Yes, sharp and immediate. But shrinking was slow, invisible, a quiet erosion of self that no one else could see but me. I had been shrinking for years, folding myself into tighter and tighter shapes just to fit the frame everyone handed me. I didn't want to fold anymore. The real test came sooner than I expected. At work, there was an upcoming team presentation. Nothing extraordinary, just a quarterly review in front of a larger department group. Normally, I approach these things with controlled confidence, voice lowered, posture squared, performing competence like it was part of the dress code. But now, every time I imagined standing at the front of that room, I saw two versions of myself. One was the familiar armor. The other was softer, not weaker, just less edited. The difference wasn't dramatic in appearance. It was in energy. For days, I debated how far I was willing to go. I wasn't ready for a full external shift in that space, not yet. But I also knew I couldn't keep pretending nothing had changed. So I decided on something subtle, but intentional. The morning of the presentation, I stood in front of my mirror longer than usual. I chose a tailored blazer, structured, yes, but beneath it, a blouse with a softer cut instead of the stiff button-down I usually wore. I let my voice settle at its natural pitch instead of forcing it lower. I styled my hair slightly differently, nothing that would spark immediate commentary, but enough that I felt the difference. And then I did something that made my heart race. I kept the necklace on, visible this time, not hidden under layers, not tucked away like a secret heartbeat. It rested openly at my collarbone, subtle but undeniable. As I walked into the office, every step felt amplified. I imagined eyes tracking me, whispers starting. But most people were absorbed in their own routines. A few glanced up, offered normal greetings. No dramatic reactions. Still, my pulse didn't calm. When it was time for the presentation, I stood at the front of the room, laptop connected, slides projected behind me. The lights felt harsher than usual. My hands were steady, but I could feel the tremor beneath the surface. I began speaking. At first, my mind fixated on the necklace. Was it catching the light? Was anyone staring at it? But as I moved into the rhythm of the presentation, something surprising happened. I forgot to monitor myself. I gestured naturally. My expressions shifted fluidly. My voice carried without force. I wasn't performing masculinity or femininity. I was just communicating. And the ease of it felt revolutionary. Halfway through, I caught my reflection faintly in the darkened window behind the audience. It was subtle, just an outline layered over the city skyline. For once, the reflection didn't look divided. When I finished, there was the usual applause. Questions followed. Engaged ones. Respectful ones. Not a single comment about my appearance. Afterward, as people filtered out of the room, one colleague paused beside me. "Great job," she said. Then she hesitated slightly. "You seem more confident lately." The word hit differently this time. Confident. Not different. Not strange. Confident. "Thanks," I replied, a small smile forming. "I've been working on that." It wasn't a lie. Later, in the quiet of the restroom, I stood in front of the mirror again, fluorescent lights humming overhead. I studied my reflection carefully. "You didn't disappear," I whispered. And I hadn't. But that day wasn't without its tremors. In the afternoon, I overheard two coworkers talking in the break room. My name surfaced in the conversation, followed by a lowered voice I couldn't fully hear. My chest tightened instantly. Old instincts surged: panic, retreat, self-correction. I stood frozen for a moment, heart pounding. Then I forced myself to breathe. Maybe they were talking about me. Maybe they weren't. But I realized something crucial. I couldn't build my life around half-heard whispers. I walked into the room anyway. The conversation shifted naturally. No tension. No confrontation. Just normalcy. The fear had been louder than reality again. That night, I returned home emotionally drained but strangely empowered. I stood before my mirror, the familiar ritual now grounding rather than secretive. I was visible, I said softly. The reflection looked back at me, tired but proud. And yet, as empowering as the day had been, I knew work was only one layer. Controlled, professional, somewhat predictable. Family was different. Friends were different. The wider world was different. A few days later, my mother called. "Can you come by this weekend?" she asked casually. "I want to talk about something." My stomach tightened. "Sure," I said. Her tone wasn't urgent. Not upset. Just deliberate. After we hung up, I stared at my reflection again. Had she noticed more than I realized? Was this about something unrelated? My mind spun through possibilities, constructing scenarios from calm acceptance to quiet disappointment. The mirror offered no answers, just my own steady gaze staring back. For the first time, I didn't ask it for reassurance. I asked myself a different question. If she asks, will you tell her? The answer rose slowly but clearly.
Yes.
And that realization scared me more than any presentation ever could. Would you like to continue to the next part?
Next.
Yes is a powerful word when you've spent most of your life saying maybe to yourself. The days leading up to the visit felt stretched thin, like time itself was holding its breath. I replayed my mother's tone over and over in my head. It hadn't sounded angry. It hadn't sounded alarmed. But it had sounded intentional. And intention is harder to ignore than emotion. On Saturday afternoon, I stood in front of my mirror again, the ritual now less about hiding and more about grounding. I didn't dress dramatically. I didn't armor up either. I chose something that felt honest but steady, a soft sweater, well-fitted trousers, the necklace resting openly at my collarbone. I studied my reflection carefully. You don't have to perform, I told myself. Just don't retreat. The drive to my parents' house felt longer than usual. Every red light gave my mind more space to spiral. What if she's noticed the subtle changes?
What if someone said something?
What if she thinks this is a phase or worse, a mistake? But beneath the anxiety was something else. A quiet readiness. When I walked in, the house smelled like tea and something sweet baking in the oven. Familiar. Safe. My mother was at the kitchen counter, slicing fruit. She looked up and smiled. "There you are," she said warmly. I exhaled slightly. Not a confrontation. Not yet. We sat at the dining table with tea between us. The conversation began normally, work updates, distant relatives, neighborhood gossip. I almost started to believe I had imagined the weight in her voice over the phone. Then she set her cup down carefully. "I wanted to ask you something," she said gently. My pulse quickened. "You've seemed different these past few months." "Not in a bad way," she added quickly. "Just different." There it was again. Different. I held her gaze this time instead of deflecting. I said quietly. She didn't look shocked. She didn't look angry. She just looked attentive. "In what way?" she asked. The room felt very still. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat, but my voice came out steadier than I expected. "I've been figuring out parts of myself that I ignored for a long time." She waited. "I don't feel comfortable living only as the version of me everyone expects," I continued. "There's a softer side of me, a more feminine side, and hiding it has been exhausting." The words felt fragile and solid at the same time, like glass reinforced with steel. She didn't interrupt. She didn't recoil. She simply absorbed. "I've been exploring that," I said. "Trying to understand what it means. Trying to be honest with myself." Silence settled between us, not hostile, contemplative. Finally, she spoke. "Is this why you seem lighter lately?" The question startled me. "Yes," I admitted. "I think so." She leaned back slightly, studying my face the way she used to when I was a child trying to explain a complicated feeling. "Are you unhappy with who you are?" she asked carefully. The question was layered. I was unhappy pretending, I said. I'm not trying to erase myself. I'm trying to integrate parts one buried. Her eyes dropped briefly to the necklace at my collarbone. I watched the moment she noticed it, really noticed it. You've been carrying this quietly for a long time, she said softly. I nodded. There was no dramatic shift in her expression. No sudden clarity or rejection. Just processing. I won't pretend I understand everything right away, she said after a pause. But I care more about you being whole than you being what I expected. The words hit me like a wave. Whole. Not normal. Not traditional. Whole. My vision blurred slightly as emotion rose unexpectedly. I hadn't prepared for acceptance. I had prepared for negotiation. I was scared to tell you. I admitted. I know, she said gently. I could see it. A small, almost incredulous laugh escaped me. You could. A mother sees when her child is holding their breath, she replied. That sentence broke something open inside me. We talked for over an hour. She asked careful questions, not accusatory but curious. About how long I'd felt this way. About whether I felt safe. About what I needed. Not once did she raise her voice. Not once did she dismiss me. At one point, she reached across the table and squeezed my hand. You don't have to rush into anything, she said. But you also don't have to hide from me.
Hide.
The word felt smaller now. When I left that evening, the sky was streaked with soft pink and gold. I sat in my car for a moment before starting the engine, overwhelmed by a feeling I hadn't anticipated. Relief. Not total certainty. Not a solved future. But relief that I wasn't alone in my own home. That night, standing before my mirror, I felt something shift again. The mirror no longer felt like the only place I could exist honestly. It felt like a starting point, not a refuge. You're not fighting everyone, I whispered to my reflection. You're fighting the fear of everyone. And that fear was shrinking. But acceptance is not universal. A few days later, a distant relative messaged me after seeing a recent photo where my presentation was subtly softer. The message was brief. Are you okay? You seem confused lately.
Confused.
The word stung. For a moment, old doubt surged back in. What if they're right? What if this is confusion? What if I'm complicating something that could just stay simple? I stared at my reflection, searching for uncertainty. Instead, I saw clarity, hard-earned and fragile, but real. I typed back carefully. I'm not confused. I'm becoming more honest. The send button felt like another threshold crossed. As I put my phone down, I realized something profound. The mirror had once been the only place I dared to see myself fully. Now, it was just a reflection of a truth I was learning to live out loud. And for the first time in my life, the idea of being seen didn't feel like danger. It felt like freedom waiting to be claimed. Would you like to continue to the next part? Next. Freedom is quieter than I expected. I used to imagine it would arrive like a thunderclap, dramatic, undeniable, the kind of moment that redraws the entire sky. But instead, it came in small permissions. In choosing not to lower my voice. In not flinching when someone looked at me a second longer than usual. In leaving the house without rehearsing explanations in my head. It came in breathing fully. After the conversation with my mother, something subtle but irreversible shifted inside me. The fear of catastrophic rejection, the kind that had kept me frozen for years, loosened its grip. Not entirely, but enough. The mirror, once my only confidant, began to feel less like a hiding place and more like a checkpoint. I would stand before it each morning and ask myself one question. Are you shrinking today? If the answer was yes, I adjusted. If the answer was no, I walked out the door, as I was. Weeks passed, and the changes became less about visible markers and more about presence. I let my gestures soften without correcting them mid-motion. I stopped forcing my laughter into a lower register. I allowed myself to exist in conversation without calculating how I was being perceived every second. Some people noticed. Most didn't. One afternoon at work, a newer colleague approached me after meeting. I hope this isn't weird to say, she began, hesitating slightly. But I really appreciate how comfortable you seem in yourself. It makes it easier for the rest of us to be. Her words caught me off guard. Easier for the rest of us. I hadn't considered that my internal battle might ripple outward, that my quiet shift could create space for someone else to breathe differently. Thank you, I said, meaning it more deeply than she could have known. That evening, I stood in front of my mirror again, the familiar frame now almost symbolic of every step I'd taken. I studied my face, noticing how different my eyes looked compared to months ago. They weren't searching anymore. They were steady. But freedom doesn't erase complexity. There were still moments, in crowded places, in unfamiliar spaces, where my body tensed automatically, where I felt hyper-aware of my silhouette, my voice, my movements. Social conditioning doesn't dissolve overnight. Years of self-monitoring leave muscle memory. One night, at a larger public event with colleagues and extended acquaintances, I felt that old vigilance creeping in. The room was louder, less intimate than the art gallery. The lighting harsher. Conversations layered and unpredictable. I caught my reflection in a mirrored column near the entrance. For a split second, doubt flickered. You could tone it down, a voice suggested. You could blend more. I stared at myself, heart pounding. Then I remembered the nights I had stood in my bedroom, whispering to my reflection, asking how much longer I would hide. I'm not going backward, I murmured under my breath.
And I didn't.
I moved through the room as myself, not exaggerated, not defensive, just present. There were glances. Of course there were. Curiosity exists. But there were also smiles, normal conversations, laughter. The world did not fracture around me. Later that evening, as I stepped outside for air, a cool breeze brushing against my skin, I felt something I hadn't allowed myself to name before.
Pride.
Not pride in defiance. Not pride in rebellion. Pride in endurance. In honesty. In the quiet courage it took to face myself before facing anyone else. I thought back to the first night with a cardigan. The trembling hands. The tears in front of the mirror. The fear that alignment would destroy everything. Instead, alignment had built something sturdier. Not everyone understood. Some relatives kept their distance. A few acquaintances asked awkward questions. There were moments of fatigue, times when explaining felt heavy. But there was also connection. Unexpected support. Subtle affirmations. And most importantly, there was internal peace. One evening, months after that first whispered, "How much longer?" I stood in front of the mirror again. But this time, I didn't come to it with a question. I came to it with gratitude. You kept my secret, I said softly. And you showed me the truth. The reflection looking back at me was not a separate persona. Not a costume. Not a hidden twin. It was me. Integrated. Layered.
Whole.
I realized then that the mirror had never been the point. It wasn't about fabric or polish or presentation alone. It was about permission. Permission to feel softness without labeling it weakness. Permission to exist without editing myself into something narrower. I had hidden this side of me for years because I thought it would fracture my life. Instead, it healed a fracture I didn't know I'd been carrying. And as I turned away from the mirror that night, not to hide, not to rehearse, but simply to live, I understood something with a clarity that made my chest ache. The bravest thing I ever did wasn't stepping outside dressed differently. It was looking at my own reflection and deciding I deserved to stay. Would you like to continue to the next part?
Next. Stay.
For so long, staying had meant remaining silent, remaining acceptable, remaining within the narrow margins drawn for me before I even understood what margins were. But now staying meant something entirely different. It meant staying with myself when things felt uncertain. Staying visible when invisibility would have been easier. Staying honest when silence still tempted me. And honesty, I was learning, doesn't end with one conversation or one brave evening. It evolves. Months passed, and the changes that once felt monumental became woven into the texture of my daily life. The necklace was no longer a symbol I nervously touched for reassurance. It was simply part of my wardrobe. The softness in my voice wasn't something I monitored. It was just how I spoke. The mirror still stood in my room, but I no longer rushed toward it at night, as if it were the only place I could exist. Sometimes, I would catch my reflection unexpectedly, in a storefront window, in the glossy surface of a car, in the dark screen of my phone, and feel a quiet shock of recognition. That's me. Not a secret version. Not a rehearsal. Just me. But growth rarely moves in a straight line. One evening, I attended a larger family gathering, a wedding reception filled with extended relatives, acquaintances, and people who remembered me only as the child I used to be. The room shimmered with lights and music, laughter echoing against high ceilings. I had chosen an outfit that felt true to me, elegant, balanced, unmistakably reflective of my evolving identity. As I entered, I felt the shift in energy almost immediately. Some faces lit up warmly. Others paused a beat too long. A few conversations quieted subtly before resuming. Nothing overt. Nothing confrontational. But noticeable. For a moment, the old instinct surged back like muscle memory.
Shrink. Adjust.
Make it easier for them. I felt my shoulders tighten. My breath grow shallow. The noise of the room seemed to amplify, pressing against me. Then I saw my mother across the room. She met my eyes, held my gaze, and smiled. Not the polite smile reserved for public appearances. The steady one. The grounding one. She walked over without hesitation and slipped her arm through mine. "You look like yourself," she said softly. 3 simple words. Not, "You look nice." Not, "You look different." You look like yourself. The tension in my chest loosened. We moved through the room together, greeting relatives, exchanging pleasantries. Some asked cautious questions. Some avoided them entirely. A distant uncle made a comment about modern times, half joking, half probing. I met his gaze calmly. "Times change," I said evenly. "So do people." He didn't argue. He just nodded, unsure where to place me. And for the first time, I didn't feel the need to make it easier for him. Later, standing near the edge of the dance floor, I caught my reflection in a mirrored wall panel. The light scattered across the glass, fracturing my image into small glimmers. I stepped closer, studying the layered reflections. There was no single, rigid outline anymore. There were facets. Strength and softness. Past and present. Fear and courage. All coexisting. The mirror, once a silent accomplice to secrecy, had become a witness to integration. As the night wore on, something unexpected happened. A younger cousin, barely in their teens, approached me quietly. "Can I ask you something?" they said, eyes cautious but curious. "Of course." They hesitated. "How did you know it was okay to be different?" The question stopped me. I saw myself in their uncertainty. The same searching gaze. The same unspoken weight. I glanced briefly at the mirrored wall behind us. I didn't know at first, I admitted. I just knew it was harder to pretend than to be honest. They absorbed that slowly. "Does it get less scary?" they asked. I smiled gently. "It gets more worth it." They nodded, something softening in their posture. As they walked away, I felt something shift inside me again, not a dramatic transformation, but a deepening. This wasn't just about my own freedom anymore. It was about what visibility makes possible for others. That night, back in my room, I stood in front of my mirror once more. The ritual had changed over time. It wasn't about seeking permission or reassurance anymore. It was about reflection in the truest sense. "I hid you because I thought you would ruin everything," I said quietly to the person staring back at me. The reflection held steady. "But you didn't ruin my life," I continued. "You gave it depth." I thought about the years of silence, the rehearsed gestures, the late-night tears, the whispered "how much longer" that had once felt like a plea. Now, the question had an answer. As long as it takes to become whole. I reached up and touched the mirror lightly, fingertips brushing the cool glass. "I'm not hiding anymore," I whispered. And this time, it wasn't a promise. It was a fact. "Would you like to continue to the next part?" The words settled in my chest like a quiet heartbeat, steady and sure. Not flashy. Not triumphant. Just real. I realized that being whole wasn't a destination I could reach in a single act. It was a collection of choices, small and cumulative, stitched together over months of courage. Each necklace clasped, each word spoken, each step outside as myself had been a thread. Now they all converged into something stronger than fear, something that wasn't fragile. I started noticing subtle ways my life shifted without me orchestrating it. Colleagues treated me with normalcy, yes, but there was an ease in their interactions, a little more room for authenticity on both sides. Friends became allies in ways I hadn't anticipated. Even strangers on the street, whose opinions I barely registered, seemed to affirm my existence simply by letting me pass. The world didn't explode when I lived openly. It simply moved around me, and I moved with it. The mirror, once a strict gatekeeper of my private truths, had become a kind of confidant I could trust without fear. I no longer rehearsed my reflection before stepping into social spaces. I simply studied it, allowed it to anchor me, and let the image remind me who I had always been. The reflection was no longer divided into halves, the feminine and the masculine, the private and the public. It was integrated, layered, unapologetic. One evening, after a long day of meetings, casual hangouts, and small victories, I sat cross-legged on my bedroom floor in front of the mirror. The city lights filtered in, casting soft patterns across the wall. I traced the outline of the necklace at my collarbone and let my gaze wander across the familiar features I had once tried to hide. "You're not someone else," I whispered softly. "You're yourself." Fully. A wave of emotion rolled through me, a mixture of relief, pride, and a quiet gratitude that surprised me with its intensity. For years, I had feared judgment, rejection, invisibility. Yet, here I was, seen, acknowledged, and steadily existing as the person I had always been beneath layers of fear. I realized then that living openly, even subtly, didn't just affect my own life. It offered a roadmap, a quiet permission, for anyone watching me navigate identity, fear, and self-acceptance. Courage, I understood, doesn't need a stage or an audience. Sometimes it's just the act of showing up, the act of staying present, the act of saying yes to yourself when the world has long said no. The mirror reflected more than a face now. It reflected years of struggle, resilience, and finally, alignment. I reached out, fingertips brushing the glass, and smiled. Not because the journey was over, it never truly ends, but because I was no longer hiding. I had stepped into the life I was meant to live, and I was whole. And in that quiet, luminous moment, I understood. The years I spent hiding weren't wasted. They were preparation. Preparation for the person who could finally stand without fear, fully seen, fully present, fully herself. I exhaled slowly, feeling the tension I hadn't realized I was still carrying melt away. The reflection held me in its steady gaze. No judgment, no expectation, just acceptance. For the first time in a very long time, I whispered to no one but myself. I hid this side of me for years, and now I don't have to.
And that was enough.
The mirror didn't judge. The world didn't collapse. I simply existed.
Free. Whole.
Visible. Would you like me to continue to the next part? Next. Visible.
Whole. Free.
The next weeks felt surreal in their quiet continuity. There were no dramatic fanfares or proclamations, no sudden, sweeping acceptance from everyone around me. Life, as always, continued, but now I was part of it in a way that felt honest rather than rehearsed. I noticed things I hadn't before. The way sunlight hit the curve of my shoulder in the morning, the subtle way my voice lingered longer on words that mattered, the soft comfort of clothing that felt like an extension of my identity rather than a mask. One evening, after a long walk through my neighborhood, I stopped outside a bookstore. The display window reflected me in the dim light of the street lamps. I looked at myself and realized something profound. I wasn't shrinking anymore. Not physically, not socially, not emotionally. I occupied space fully, without hesitation. The familiar ache of fear that had accompanied every public step had softened into awareness, like a quiet drumbeat reminding me of what I had endured and overcome. I remembered the first time I had dared to walk as myself. Months ago, the hesitant steps on an empty street that had felt like stepping into a storm. Back then, the world had seemed fragile, and so had I. But standing now, reflected in that bookstore window, I felt a continuity of self, a line connecting trembling first steps to these calm, deliberate ones. I saw strength in the way I held myself, a softness in the curve of my shoulders, a clarity in my eyes. I smiled faintly, almost in disbelief. The phone buzzed. A message from Sam. Met a friend for coffee today, told them about you. They said they're inspired. I stared at the words. Inspired. Not changed, not judged, not altered, inspired. The ripple effect of my honesty was touching others, quietly, invisibly. I realized then that courage, like water, spreads through cracks. Even the smallest acts of truth can seep outward and soften edges in ways you never imagine. That night, standing once again before my mirror, I no longer rehearsed. I didn't adjust, didn't hide, didn't measure my existence against expectations. I simply gazed at the reflection, layered, whole, visible. The necklace glinted faintly at my collarbone. A simple ornament. A quiet symbol. A thread connecting every step of this journey. I hid this side of me for years. I whispered softly, letting the words sink in. And now I get to live it. And in that moment, I understood fully. The story wasn't about revelation, or fear, or even acceptance. It was about presence, about choosing to show up in the world as you are, fully, every single day. And for the first time, the mirror didn't ask questions. The reflection didn't hold judgment. It only said, quietly, unmistakably, you are here. You are enough. You are real. I exhaled. Deep. Slow. The kind of breath that carries relief, pride, and joy all at once. I reached up and lightly touched the glass, not as someone hiding from herself, but as someone acknowledging a life reclaimed. The world outside remained unpredictable, full of people who might or might not understand. But the person I carried inside, the one I had hidden, nurtured, and finally accepted, had settled into me completely. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel the urge to conceal, to minimize, to edit. I simply existed.